everyone, this is ShadowXXE here, and today I am back with a new video. Now, this video is going to be more like a series, to be honest. I'm thinking of restarting the PC Parts Explained series, but with more editing and a better explanation. Anyway, let's get right into the video. Our first point here, what is a CPU? CPU stands for Central Processing Unit, and it's basically the brain of the computer. It performs mathematical calculations, as well as some physics-based calculations as well. Brings us to our next point, how does a CPU work? CPUs work on a very basic premise. Fetch, decode, and execute instructions. Modern CPUs can do this billions of times per second. The rate at which a PC fetches, decodes, and executes is called its core clock. Modern CPUs will have a core clock of 1 GHz to 4 GHz. This means each individual core on the CPU will be able to perform that fetch, decode, execute cycle 1 to 4 billion times per second. Now, if you notice that I said core there, and you're confused what I mean by that, well, basically, put it simply, that a core is like almost a mini CPU in itself. A core does the fetch, decode, execute cycle. Now, back in the old days, CPUs just used to have one core. However, nowadays they can range from 2 cores to 64 cores sometimes. It's basically like having 64 little CPUs on the CPU. Now, I know that may sound a bit confusing, but put it simply, the more cores a CPU has, the more efficient it will be, because the more it can process at once. Of course, this is also dependent on per core performance, which is the performance a core can output. Put it simply, that some quad cores may outperform some older 6 cores because their cores output more performance. As an example, think of this. You have 6 low performance 1 core CPUs, and you have 4 high performance 1 core CPUs. The four high performance ones are essentially double the performance of the low performance ones. This can apply to our CPUs as well. The cores on the new 4 core CPU are higher performance than the ones in the 6 core CPU. Thus they'll perform twice as fast, and the CPU itself will be twice as fast. However, core clocks and cores are not the only thing affecting CPU performance. You also have threads. Threads essentially hold information for the CPU until it's ready to process them. However, there is a thing called multi-threading, which basically combines multiple threads together in order to form a virtual core. Saying that, they don't actually process any instructions, they just feed information into the cores faster and faster. To understand this, you first have to understand how a non-multi-threaded CPU works. Basically, only one thread can be active at a time, and only that one thread is shooting information into the CPU. As you can imagine, this could slow things down considerably. However, with multi-threading, basically lets multiple threads to be active at a time, which, as you can imagine, would speed up things considerably, effectively causing the CPU to perform like it has more cores than it actually does. Now, on to the final thing that you need to know about a CPU, cache. Cache is essentially like miniature RAM. It holds information from the threads, which will then lead it into the CPU. The reason cache is important is because the more of it you have, generally, the more instructions you're able to hold for the CPU, and the faster the CPU will run. Generally, there are 3 types of cache. Level 1 cache, which is the fastest type of cache, Level 2 cache, which is the second fastest, and Level 3 cache, which is the slowest. Generally, you'll have less Level 1 cache than you do Level 2 cache, and more Level 3 cache than you do Level 2 cache. Basically, it's in descending order. Level 1 cache, you have the least amount of cache. Level 2 cache is the second most amount of cache. Level 3 cache, you've got the most amount of cache. Now, that's just because Level 3 cache and Level 2 cache is cheaper to produce. That's usually because Level 1 cache is actually on the CPU itself. Level 2 and 3 cache, most of the time, actually, you'd find Level 2 cache on the CPU, but generally, sometimes you might find it on the motherboard. You'll definitely find Level 3 cache on the motherboard. Now, on to our next section. How does a CPU help me in gaming? Now, as we've stated before, a CPU generally handles calculations and logic. So in games, this could mean how many NPCs are in the area, how much damage is dealt by a weapon, bullet physics, although that is also partly handled by the graphics processing unit or the graphics card, which I'll explain in a later video. CPU also handles environmental factors like how many buildings are in a shot, a cutscene, the speed of a car. Now you're probably looking at all of this and thinking, wow, CPU is probably really important in gaming, and to some extent you're right. However, there are a few fields where the CPU fails. Fluid physics, air physics, trajectory, lighting, shading, and tessellation. All of these are handled by the graphics card, which I'm going to get into in my next video. But basically what I'm trying to say is, your CPU is important in gaming, but not as important as your graphics card. It's best to spend more on your graphics card and less on your CPU, because you don't want to cheap out on your CPU either, just get a reasonably priced one. Now on to our final section of this video, how to install a CPU. Now there are two types of CPUs. There are LGA CPUs or land grid array CPUs. Those have the pins on the motherboard and little contact pads on the CPU. And PGA CPUs, which stands for pin grid array. Those have the pins on the CPU and little holes in the motherboard. Generally, Intel uses LGA CPUs and AMD uses PGA CPUs and LGA CPUs, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to tell you how to install their PGA CPUs since they're most common. To start off installing your AMD CPU, lift the little metal retention arm from under the plastic clip. The retention arm should look like a small piece of metal right next to the CPU socket. Once you've ensured that the tension arm is fully up, grab your CPU. Make sure not to grab it by the pins, as you can get your finger oils on the pins, which may damage the motherboard. Next, line up the golden triangle on the CPU with the little indent of a triangle on the motherboard. Once you've lined those up, place the CPU pins down, ensuring that the golden triangle is now on top of the indented triangle. After you ensure that, give the CPU a little wiggle in its socket to make sure that it's nice and tight, and then lower the retention arm under the clip again. And now you've installed your CPU. Install the cooler on it. Please refer to its manual, as cooler designs differ from cooler to cooler. Now on to how to install your Intel CPU. First, lift up the retention arm from under the metal clip. The retention arm should look like a little metal pole next to the socket. Sometimes there can be two, so ensure that you have both lifted. After you've ensured that you have all the retention arms lifted, lift the faceplate off the socket. The faceplate should be the entire metal structure that is currently sitting on the socket. Next, grab your CPU, locate the two notches on the CPU. The notches may be located differently depending on what kind of CPU you have, but generally it'll be two notches on the side. Make sure to line this up with the two side notches on the motherboard as well. These will look like two little plastic divots. After you've located those two, locate the golden triangle on the motherboard. This should look similar to the golden triangle on the AMD CPU. After you've located those three, place the CPU contact pads down in the motherboard, ensuring that the notches on the motherboard line up with the notches on the CPU. You should also ensure that the golden triangle is facing down on the motherboard, like this, and not up on the motherboard, as placing the CPU in the wrong way could cause a motherboard short circuit. After you've ensured that the CPU is correctly aligned, place the faceplate back down and put the retention arm back in its original place. When you're putting down the retention arm, it may seem like you're about to break the board, but don't worry, you aren't, it's normal. If you've bought your motherboard new, you might notice that a plastic faceplate is actually popped off. That is completely normal, but please keep that in case you need to send your board back to the manufacturer for repairs, as they will require that to be sent back with the board. And that is all for this tutorial and PC Parts Explained episode. I hope you enjoyed. Please leave a like, comment and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video, and leave a dislike if you absolutely fucking hated it.
Hello, do you receive my echo? My life is a party.